Hey guys, my name is Brad from the Cast Ice Podcast Network, and welcome to G.I. Joe on the Tabletop for a very special Cobra Convergence V episode. Now, guys, this podcast talks about how me as a grown-up hobbyist, how I can turn the toys of my childhood into playable toy soldiers on the tabletop that I can use in lots of different war games and basically get to recreate my treasured G.I. Joe collection, which unfortunately still resides at my parents' house in the States. Me being an American who's lived in Australia for 15 years, it is much easier for me to recreate it at a much smaller scale, and I've really enjoyed this project. This whole channel is dedicated to my ongoing project to create full-blown G.I. Joe, Cobra, and eventually Iron Grenadier and October Guard forces. We'll see how that goes, though. Let's not jump ahead of ourselves. Let's get into today. Now, if we are going to talk about Cobra Vehicles, the iconic Cobra Vehicles from early in the G.I. Joe toy range, of course we're going to talk about the big ones. We're going to talk about the Hiss. We're going to talk about the Stinger. We're going to talk about the Fang. We're going to talk about the Rattler. And I would say the fifth thumb on that finger is, of course, the first towable weapon system in the Cobra range, which, of course, was the Assault Systems Pod, or the Cobra Asp. Now, this isn't necessarily the most iconic vehicle on that list. In fact, you could probably argue it's the least iconic. It only appeared in the Real American Hero comic run a handful of times, if that. It was more prevalent in the TV series, but I was always more of a comic guy. Now, you might say, well, Brad, why did you pick this for Cobra Convergence? I mean, well, A, it's an iconic Cobra vehicle, but B, of those vehicles that I listed, this was the only one that when I was a child, I did not own out of that list. And so for me, when I started my project of recreating my Cobra and G.I. Joe forces on the tabletop, one of the very first things that I absolutely made sure that I had was the Asp. And that's why we're going to talk about it today. Well, let's get into it, shall we? Now, the Asp is interesting because the Asp and the Rattler came out in 1984, and they were theoretically the first of what became a long run of dark blue Cobra vehicles. Now, of course, Cobra troopers and Cobra officers, and even Cobra Commander to a degree, wore dark blue as part of their uniforms. And yet the Hiss and the Stinger and, of course, the Fang were black. And so the original vehicles were very black and red centric. But it wasn't until we got to the Asp and the Rattler that we started to see the dark blue. Now, you could argue in 1983, the Viper Glider was blue-ish, but it wasn't the dark blue that we came to know and love as being associated with the Cobra vehicles, and carried on way into 1985 with the introduction of the dark blue variant of the Snake Armor, the Cobra Ferret, the Cobra Night Landing, of course the Cobra Bunker, and the related but separate Cobra rifle range. Well, let's talk about the Asp itself, shall we? Now, the Assault System Pod was a stationary single-man weapon system that could be towed into place by other vehicles. And if we're talking 1984 standards and we're a Cobra, of course we're talking about the Stinger or the Hiss. Now, it has one proper weapon system, which is dual 120mm Eliminator cannons. It says it right there on the front of the box. Now, that is important, and we'll come back to that in just one second, because there are conflicting reports about what the weapons this vehicle had on it are and what its purpose is. Now, it's largely thought that the Asp was an anti-aircraft weapon. It was an AA gun that would be used to fire at G.I. Joe helicopters and jets that would be, flying over Cobra installations. And yet, when we see it in the comic book and when we see it in the TV series, the Asp is often seen as shooting at ground or water-based vehicles. I know that when I was growing up, one of my best friends had two Asps, and when we had battles and when I would assault his Cobra fortress / castle, he would always have a Hiss on either side. I believe he called them the fangs of his defense, which I always thought was a nice turn of phrase, being a little kid. Anyway, let's talk about how I made mine. Now, all the vehicles for my project are printed in 1/56 scale resin. They are 3D printed in resin. Now, as you can see here is a Cobra Rattler, and there is my 3D print next to a full size. Now that is unfortunately my much abused, maligned Rattler from when I was a kid, missing many pieces, many of which I have since replaced in the intervening years and still resides at my parents' house. The other Rattler, though, I recently finished painting and I will be doing a video on soon. I have yet to come up with a base and stand to stand it on. But as you can see, it is significantly smaller than the original. Now, the problem with 3D printing material in resin is that sometimes in the curing process, thin surfaces can bend. And though those wings were not thin on that 3D printed picture that you can see on the left, I had to actually cut the wings off at the engines for the Rattler and replace it with plasticard just so I would have nice straight wings. God, I love those missile racks. Anyway, if we talk about this resin material, you can clearly see it there. And here is, of course, another asp that has been printed. Now, I've had mine printed hollow. Now, that is particularly important because it makes the vehicle very lightweight, easy to ship if you're having your vehicles printed in the United States and shipped over. It also makes them far less expensive to print. The downside is, though, they are just not as durable as the solid prints. That said, I'm pretty careful with my things, so I risked having them printed hollow. Now let's move on to the actual assault system pod. Now, if we look, this is from the G.I. Joe Order of Battle comic book. Now, I often use this as a source when I'm looking for information, for infantry. However, I do like to look at them for vehicles as well. The problem is the Order of Battle often has information on it, vehicularly wise, especially around the weapons, that is inconsistent with what might be on the actual blueprints and what is talked about on the toys themselves. So if we look, we'll see it's got the weight of 1,200 pounds. It's a towed vehicle, but it lists the armament as 2 variable rate of fire, 76 millimeter anti-tank suppressive fire electric cannons with 350 rounds each. Now, it is correct in that it traverses 360 degrees, and the guns do elevate up to 90 degrees. In fact, they elevate more than that if it is elevated, if the system itself is elevated up. Now, I do like to look at that. I might have to leave the Order of Battle, courtesy of Yojo, out this particular time. And let's go to the actual blueprints themselves. If we look at the actual blueprints that came with the toy, number 2 is, of course, the dual synchronized 120 millimeter Eliminator cannons. Now, that is a much larger caliber, and that is a much more serious risk of putting a hole in something like a tank. So, again, I think that though this was perhaps initially designed to be an anti-aircraft weapon, you can tell because of the way it turns, you get the idea with these that they can turn quickly and they can track and follow vehicles traveling at high speeds like aircrafts or possibly a hovercraft, depending on the issue of the comic. These are absolutely possible to be emplaced around Cobra, fortresses, emplacements, and defenses to ward off G.I. Joe attack. Well, if we move to where it appeared in the comic book, one of my favorite appearances in the comic run was in issue 36, where the asp, in fact, many asps were on a Cobra atoll, surrounded by water, and the only way the Joes could attack it was in the hovercraft, the Killer Whale, which we saw in the cover, and that is the cover of 36. Now, this also was the first appearance of the Cobra hydrofoil, although interestingly, it was those hydrofoils were piloted by just regular Cobra troopers. But we also see we have asps here and a Cobra officer directing them. It was a great issue. It's a cat and mouse game all around the atoll. I highly recommend reading it if you have not read G.I. Joe number 36. As I said, it's one of my faves. We also saw the asp actually being used for probably its primary purpose, which is anti-aircraft during the attack or the Battle of Springfield, where Joes attacked the Cobra forces in Springfield. And of course, that's the same issue where we see Serpentor in the field for the first time. Again, iconic, and it was important and great that the asp got included in that conflict. Now, the actual asp toy, as I said, I did not have this as a kid. It was that distinct navy blue, the same navy blue as the Cobra Rattler. And some of the defining features that if you were trying to recreate this for the tabletop would be A, the fold-up wheels, B, the dual cannons with the defensive shields on the front. But the number one aspect for me would be sort of the way it looks like, almost like a tank turret on its 360 mount. And it doesn't, the gunner is sitting in that roll cage mount. Now, when I held up mine a minute ago, this is a spare one that I have yet to paint, you'll notice mine's solid. It doesn't have that roll cage. And for me, that is what really makes the Asp an Asp. And so when I made mine, and here's my painted version, also here, I got around that. Instead of trying to cut into it, knowing that mine was hollow, which is why I mentioned it before, I instead painted the detail in. And I imagined that rather than having that standard roll cage, what would happen if the Asp was glassed in? Perhaps with, some sort of bullet-resistant glass or material. So I sort of went with that route, and I painted it exactly the same way I would paint any of my other vehicles. But I very carefully hand-painted those windows in. As you can see, I tried to go with the dark blue, but because I like my vehicles to pop on the tabletop, because when you're playing, you're often 3 feet away, your eyes from the actual tabletop, I like to put a lot of extreme highlights in there so that the vehicles pop out of the terrain on the tabletop. Terrible for camouflage, but looks very striking when you're playing toy soldiers. Now I have, of course, put it next to a Cobra Stinger. Here is a 1/56 scale resin Cobra Stinger that I also painted up. Now you'll notice that the Stinger doesn't have its distinctive missile rack. That's because a lot of the games that I play with, if you have a towed vehicle, it requires something to tow them onto the tabletop. So I needed something to tow. Now I thought the most obvious choice for me to tow an Asp would be a Stinger. And I have several Stingers. This one happens to be literally designed, in my case, to be the tow to pull my Asp, because I absolutely wanted to have that Asp on the tabletop, and I wanted to have a vehicle that could pull it that was reflected in the rules that I'm playing with. Now, you'll notice that I've only talked about the blue Asp so far, the traditional colors. There is, of course, the Python Patrol Asp, which came out much later in the toy run. And look, I'm not going to say that I've got plans for this little guy, but you know that I do. Now, you will also notice that in all of the pictures that I've shown so far, the Asp has been in its traditional sitting on its base configuration, the kind of configuration that we can see in this picture right here. However, when I make the Python Patrol one, and this one's only roughly blue tacked together, you know I am going to not only try painting that crazy paint scheme, but I'm going to paint it elevated so that I can have both kinds of Asps. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. It has been a pleasure to talk about the Cobra Asp, one of the iconic Cobra weapon systems. Thank you for joining us for G.I. Joe on the Tabletop. My name is Brad. And guys, if you haven't checked out the other Cobra Convergence videos, type it in. Go to HCC788 and find this year's many Cobra Convergence videos and enjoy. See you later.